Chapter 1. Antisemitism as an outrage to common sense. Many still consider it an accident that Nazi ideology centered around anti-Semitism and that Nazi policy, consistently and uncompromisingly, aimed at the persecution and finally the extermination of the Jews. Only the horror of the final catastrophe, and even more the homelessness and uprootedness of the survivors, made the Jewish question so prominent in our everyday political life. What the Nazis themselves claimed to be their chief discovery, the role of the Jewish people in world politics, and their chief interest persecution of Jews all over the world, have been regarded by public opinion as a pretext for winning the masses or an interesting device of demagogy. The failure to take seriously what the Nazis themselves said is comprehensible enough. There is hardly an aspect of contemporary history more irritating and mystifying than the fact that of all the great unsolved political questions of our century, it should have been this seemingly small and unimportant Jewish problem that had the dubious honor of setting the whole infernal machine in motion. Such discrepancies between cause and effect outrage our common sense, to say nothing of the historian's sense of balance and harmony. Compared with the events themselves, all explanations of anti-Semitism look as if they had been hastily and hazardously contrived to cover up an issue which so gravely threatens our sense of proportion and our hope for sanity. One of these hasty explanations has been the identification of anti-Semitism with rampant nationalism and its xenophobic outbursts. Unfortunately, the fact is that modern anti-Semitism grew in proportion as traditional nationalism declined and reached its climax at the exact moment when the European system of nation-states and its precarious balance of power crashed. It has already been noticed that the Nazis were not simple nationalists. Their nationalist propaganda was directed toward their fellow travelers and not their convinced members. The latter, on the contrary, were never allowed to lose sight of a consistently supranational approach to politics. Nazi nationalism had more than one aspect in common with the recent nationalistic propaganda in the Soviet Union, which is also used only to feed the prejudices of the masses. The Nazis had a genuine and never revoked contempt for the narrowness of nationalism, the provincialism of the nation-state, and they repeated time and again that their movement, international in scope like the Bolshevik movement, was more important to them than any state, which would necessarily be bound to a specific territory. And not only the Nazis, but 50 years of anti-Semitic history stand as evidence against the identification of anti-Semitism with nationalism. The first anti-Semitic parties in the last decades of the 19th century were also among the first that banded together internationally. From the very beginning, they called international congresses and were concerned with a coordination of international, or at least inter-European, activities. General trends, like the coincident decline of the nation-state and the growth of anti-Semitism, can hardly ever be explained satisfactorily by one reason or by one cause alone. The historian is in most such cases confronted with a very complex historical situation where he is almost at liberty, and that means at a loss, to isolate one factor as the spirit of the time. There are, however, a few helpful general rules. Foremost among them for our purpose is Tocqueville's great discovery in L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, Book 2, Chapter 1, of the motives for the violent hatred felt by the French masses for the aristocracy at the outbreak of the Revolution. A hatred which stimulated Burke to remark that the Revolution was more concerned with the condition of a gentleman than with the institution of a king. According to Tocqueville, the French people hated aristocrats about to lose their power more than it had ever hated them before, precisely because their rapid loss of real power was not accompanied by any considerable decline in their fortunes. As long as the aristocracy held vast powers of jurisdiction, they were not only tolerated, but respected. When noblemen lost their privileges, among others, the privilege to exploit and oppress, the people felt them to be parasites, without any real function in the rule of the country. In other words, neither oppression nor exploitation as such is ever the main cause for resentment. Wealth without visible function is much more intolerable because nobody can understand why it should be tolerated. Antisemitism reached its climax when Jews had similarly lost their public functions and their influence and were left with nothing but their wealth. When Hitler came to power, the German banks were already almost Judenrein, and it was here that Jews had held key positions for more than 100 years, and German Jewry as a whole, after a long, steady growth in social status and numbers, was declining so rapidly that statisticians predicted its disappearance in a few decades. Statistics, it is true, do not necessarily point to real historical processes. Yet it is noteworthy that to a statistician, Nazi persecution and extermination could look like a senseless acceleration of a process which would probably have come about in any case. The same holds true for nearly all Western European countries. The Dreyfus affair exploded not under the Second Empire, when French Jewry was at the height of its prosperity and influence, but under the Third Republic, when Jews had all but vanished from important positions, though not from the political scene. Austrian antisemitism became violent not under the reign of Metternich and Franz Joseph, but in the post-war Austrian Republic, when it was perfectly obvious that hardly any other group had suffered the same loss of influence and prestige through the disappearance of the Habsburg monarchy. Persecution of powerless or power-losing groups may not be a very pleasant spectacle, but it does not spring from human meanness alone. What makes men obey or tolerate real power and, on the other hand, hate people who have wealth without power is the rational instinct that power has a certain function and is of some general use. Even exploitation and oppression still make society work and establish some kind of order. Only wealth without power or aloofness without a policy are felt to be parasitical, useless, revolting, because such conditions cut all the threads which tie men together. Wealth which does not exploit lacks even the relationship which exists between exploiter and exploited. Aloofness without policy does not imply even the minimum concern of the oppressor for the oppressed. The general decline of Western and Central European Jewry, however, constitutes merely the atmosphere in which the subsequent events took place. The decline itself explains them as little as the mere loss of power by the aristocracy would explain the French Revolution. To be aware of such general rules is important only in order to refute those recommendations of common sense, which lead us to believe that violent hatred or sudden rebellion spring necessarily from great power and great abuses, and that consequently organized hatred of the Jews cannot but be a reaction to their importance and power. More serious, because it appeals to much better people, is another common sense fallacy. The Jews, because they were an entirely powerless group, caught up in the general and insoluble conflicts of the time, could be blamed for them and finally be made to appear the hidden authors of all evil. The best illustration and the best refutation of this explanation, dear to the hearts of many liberals, is in a joke which was told after the First World War. An anti-Semite claimed that the Jews had caused the war. The reply was, "Yes, the Jews and the bicyclists." "Why the bicyclists?" asks the one. "Why the Jews?" asks the other. The theory that the Jews are always the scapegoat implies that the scapegoat might have been anyone else as well. It upholds the perfect innocence of the victim, an innocence which insinuates not only that no evil was done, but that nothing at all was done, which might possibly have a connection with the issue at stake. It is true that the scapegoat theory, in its purely arbitrary form, never appears in print. Whenever, however, its adherents painstakingly try to explain why a specific scapegoat was so well suited to his role, they show that they have left the theory behind them and have got themselves involved in the usual historical research, where nothing is ever discovered except that history is made by many groups and that for certain reasons one group was singled out. The so-called scapegoat necessarily ceases to be the innocent victim whom the world blames for all its sins and through whom it wishes to escape punishment. It becomes one group of people among other groups, all of which are involved in the business of this world. And it does not simply cease to be corresponsible because it became the victim of the world's injustice and cruelty. Until recently, the inner inconsistency of the scapegoat theory was sufficient reason to discard it as one of many theories which are motivated by escapism. But the rise of terror as a major weapon of government has lent it a credibility greater than it ever had before. A fundamental difference between modern dictatorships and all other tyrannies of the past is that terror is no longer used as a means to exterminate and frighten opponents, but as an instrument to rule masses of people who are perfectly obedient. Terror, as we know it today, strikes without any preliminary provocation. Its victims are innocent, even from the point of view of the persecutor. This was the case in Nazi Germany, when full terror was directed against Jews, i.e., against people with certain common characteristics which were independent of their specific behavior. In Soviet Russia, the situation is more confused, but the facts, unfortunately, are only too obvious. On the one hand, the Bolshevik system, unlike the Nazi, never admitted theoretically that it could practice terror against innocent people, and though in view of certain practices this may look like hypocrisy, it makes quite a difference. Russian practice, on the other hand, is even more advanced than the German in one respect. Arbitrariness of terror is not even limited by racial differentiation, while the old class categories have long since been discarded, so that anybody in Russia may suddenly become a victim of the police terror. We are not concerned here with the ultimate consequence of rule by terror, namely that nobody, not even the executors, can ever be free of fear. In our context, we are dealing merely with the arbitrariness by which victims are chosen, and for this it is decisive that they are objectively innocent, that they are chosen regardless of what they may or may not have done. At first glance, this may look like a belated confirmation of the old scapegoat theory, and it is true that the victim of modern terror does show all the characteristics of the scapegoat. He is objectively and absolutely innocent because nothing he did or omitted to do matters or has any connection with his fate. There is, therefore, a temptation to return to an explanation which automatically discharges the victim of responsibility. It seems quite adequate to a reality in which nothing strikes us more forcefully than the utter innocence of the individual caught in the horror machine and his utter inability to change his fate. Terror, however, is only in the last instance of its development a mere form of government. In order to establish a totalitarian regime, terror must be presented as an instrument for carrying out a specific ideology, and that ideology must have won the adherence of many, and even a majority, before terror can be stabilized. The point for the historian is that the Jews, before becoming the main victims of modern terror, were the center of Nazi ideology, and an ideology which has to persuade and mobilize people cannot choose its victim arbitrarily. In other words, if a patent forgery like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is believed by so many people that it can become the text of a whole political movement, the task of the historian is no longer to discover a forgery. Certainly it is not to invent explanations which dismiss the chief political and historical fact of the matter, that the forgery is being believed. This fact is more important than the, historically speaking, secondary circumstance that it is forgery. The scapegoat explanation therefore remains one of the principal attempts to escape the seriousness of antisemitism and the significance of the fact that the Jews were driven into the storm center of events. Equally widespread is the opposite doctrine of an eternal antisemitism, in which Jew hatred is a normal and natural reaction to which history gives only more or less opportunity. Outbursts need no special explanation because they are natural consequences of an eternal problem. That this doctrine was adopted by professional anti-Semites is a matter of course. It gives the best possible alibi for all horrors. If it is true that mankind has insisted on murdering Jews for more than 2,000 years, then Jew killing is a normal and even human occupation, and Jew hatred is justified beyond the need of argument. The more surprising aspect of this explanation, the assumption of an eternal anti-Semitism, is that it has been adopted by a great many unbiased historians and by an even greater number of Jews. It is this odd coincidence which makes the theory so very dangerous and confusing. Its escapist basis is in both instances the same. Just as anti-Semites understandably desire to escape responsibility for their deeds, so Jews, attacked and on the defensive, even more understandably do not wish under any circumstances to discuss their share of responsibility. In the case of Jewish, and frequently of Christian, adherents of this doctrine, however, The escapist tendencies of official apologetics are based upon more important and less rational motives. The birth and growth of modern antisemitism has been accompanied by and interconnected with Jewish assimilation, the secularization and withering away of the old religious and spiritual values of Judaism. What actually happened was that great parts of the Jewish people were at the same time threatened by physical extinction from without and dissolution from within. In this situation, Jews concerned with the survival of their people would, in a curious, desperate misinterpretation, hit on the consoling idea that anti-Semitism, after all, might be an excellent means for keeping the people together, so that the assumption of eternal anti-Semitism would even imply an eternal guarantee of Jewish existence. This superstition, a secularized travesty of the idea of eternity inherent in a faith in chosenness and a messianic hope, has been strengthened through the fact that for many centuries, the Jews experienced the Christian brand of hostility, which was indeed a powerful agent of preservation, spiritually as well as politically. The Jews mistook modern anti-Christian anti-Semitism for the old religious Jew hatred, and this all the more innocently because their assimilation had bypassed Christianity in its religious and cultural aspect. Confronted with an obvious symptom of the decline of Christianity, they could therefore imagine in all ignorance that this was some revival of the so-called Dark Ages. Ignorance or misunderstanding of their own past were partly responsible for their fatal underestimation of the actual and unprecedented dangers which lay ahead. But one should also bear in mind that lack of political ability and judgment have been caused by the very nature of Jewish history, the history of a people without a government, without a country, and without a language. Jewish history offers the extraordinary spectacle of a people, unique in this respect, which began its history with a well-defined concept of history and an almost conscious resolution to achieve a well-circumscribed plan on earth, and then, without giving up this concept, avoided all political action for 2,000 years. The result was that the political history of the Jewish people became even more dependent upon unforeseen, accidental factors than the history of other nations, so that the Jews stumbled from one role to the other and accepted responsibility for none. In view of the final catastrophe, which brought the Jews so near to complete annihilation, the thesis of eternal anti-Semitism has become more dangerous than ever. Today it would absolve Jew haters of crimes greater than anybody had ever believed possible. Antisemitism, far from being a mysterious guarantee of the survival of the Jewish people, has been clearly revealed as a threat of its extermination. Yet this explanation of antisemitism, like the scapegoat theory, and for similar reasons, has outlived its refutation by reality. It stresses, after all, with different arguments but equal stubbornness, that complete and inhuman innocence, which so strikingly characterizes victims of modern terror, and therefore seems confirmed by the events. It even has the advantage over the scapegoat theory that somehow it answers the uncomfortable question, why the Jews of all people? If only with the question begging reply, eternal hostility. It is quite remarkable that the only two doctrines which at least attempt to explain the political significance of the anti-Semitic movement deny all specific Jewish responsibility and refuse to discuss matters in specific historical terms. In this inherent negation of the significance of human behavior, they bear a terrible resemblance to those modern practices and forms of government which, by means of arbitrary terror, liquidate the very possibility of human activity. Somehow, in the extermination camps, Jews were murdered as if in accordance with the explanation these doctrines had given of why they were hated, regardless of what they had done or omitted to do, regardless of vice or virtue. Moreover, the murderers themselves, only obeying orders and proud of their passionless efficiency, uncannily resembled the innocent instruments of an inhuman, impersonal course of events, which the doctrine of eternal anti-Semitism had considered them to be. Such common denominators between theory and practice are by themselves no indication of historical truth, although they are an indication of the timely character of such opinions, and explain why they sound so plausible to the multitude. The historian is concerned with them only insofar as they are themselves part of his history, and because they stand in the way of his search for truth. Being a contemporary, he is as likely to succumb to their persuasive force as anybody else. Caution in handling generally accepted opinions that claim to explain whole trends of history is especially important for the historian of modern times, because the last century has produced an abundance of ideologies that pretend to be keys to history, but are actually nothing but desperate efforts to escape responsibility. Plato, in his famous fight against the ancient sophists, discovered that their universal art of enchanting the mind by arguments, Phaedrus 261, had nothing to do with truth, but aimed at opinions which by their very nature are changing, and which are valid only at the time of the agreement and as long as the agreement lasts. Theaetetus 172. He also discovered the very insecure position of truth in the world, for from opinions comes persuasion and not from truth. Phaedrus 260. The most striking difference between ancient and modern sophists is that the ancients were satisfied with a passing victory of the argument at the expense of truth, whereas the moderns want a more lasting victory at the expense of reality. In other words, one destroyed the dignity of human thought, whereas the others destroy the dignity of human action. The old manipulators of logic were the concern of the philosopher, whereas the modern manipulators of facts stand in the way of the historian. For history itself is destroyed, and its comprehensibility, based upon the fact that it is enacted by men and therefore can be understood by men, is in danger whenever facts are no longer held to be part and parcel of the past and present world, and are misused to prove this or that opinion. There are, to be sure, few guides left through the labyrinth of inarticulate facts if opinions are discarded and tradition is no longer accepted as unquestionable. Such perplexities of historiography, however, are very minor consequences, considering the profound upheavals of our time and their effect upon the historical structures of Western mankind. Their immediate result has been to expose all those components of our history which up to now had been hidden from our view. This does not mean that what came crashing down in this crisis, perhaps the most profound crisis in Western history since the downfall of the Roman Empire, was mere facade, although many things have been revealed as facade that only a few decades ago we thought were indestructible essences. The simultaneous decline of the European nation-state and growth of anti-Semitic movements, the coincident downfall of nationally organized Europe, and the extermination of Jews, which was prepared for by the victory of anti-Semitism over all competing isms in the preceding struggle for persuasion of public opinion, have to be taken as a serious indication of the source of anti-Semitism. Modern anti-Semitism must be seen in the more general framework of the development of the nation-state, and at the same time its source must be found in certain aspects of Jewish history and specifically Jewish functions during the last centuries. If, in the final stage of disintegration, anti-Semitic slogans proved the most effective means of inspiring and organizing great masses of people for imperialist expansion and destruction of the old forms of government, then the previous history of the relationship between Jews and the state must contain elementary clues to the growing hostility between certain groups of society and the Jews. We shall show this development in the next chapter. If, furthermore, the steady growth of the modern mob, that is, of the déclassés of all classes, produced leaders who, undisturbed by the question of whether the Jews were sufficiently important to be made the focus of a political ideology, repeatedly saw in them the key to history and the central cause of all evils, then the previous history of the relationship between Jews and society must contain the elementary indications of the hostile relationship between the mob and the Jews. We shall deal with the relationship between Jews and society in the third chapter. The fourth chapter deals with the Dreyfus Affair, a kind of dress rehearsal for the performance of our own time, because of the peculiar opportunity it offers of seeing, in a brief historical moment, the otherwise hidden potentialities of anti-Semitism as a major political weapon within the framework of 19th century politics and its relatively well-balanced sanity. This case has been treated in full detail. The following 3 chapters, to be sure, analyze only the preparatory elements, which were not fully realized until the decay of the nation-state and the development of imperialism reached the foreground of the political scene.